Legends say he stole from the rich and gave to the poor. Clad in Lincoln green with a bow in hand and a band of merry men at his side, Robin Hood became the symbol of rebellion, justice, and adventure. Over the centuries, his tale has been retold countless times, from books and films to, of course, video games. But who exactly was Robin Hood? And how has this folklore hero been portrayed in the virtual world? Today, we're diving deep into the origins of the Robin Hood legend and exploring how video game developers have brought the famous outlaw to life in video games across different genres. So grab your bow, saddle up your horse, and join us on today's trip down memory card lane. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I hope these words find you well. Hello and welcome to the 222nd episode of our video game history podcast, A Trip Down Memory Card Lane. Each week, we'll tell you a story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game or the people that have created it. It can be about a console or the technology that brought it to life. We often talk about the companies that bring it all together, making our hobby, video games, a reality. While telling you each story, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world as its legacy. Today, we are exploring the legendary figure of Robin Hood, his origins in folklore, and his fascinating depictions across decades of video game history. I'm David Casson, and as always, I'm joined by my co host, who I'm sure would have been Robin Hood's go to archer in Sherwood Forest. He's my brother, Rob Casson. So, Rob, if you were a part of Robin Hood's merry men, what role would you take on in the band of outlaws?
Uh, well, I guess I'd be an archer.
What would your nickname be?
Uh, the archer.
Okay.
Yeah, didn't expect that one, did you?
No, I expected a name, a nickname of some kind.
Well, that is the nickname,
Your nickname is the Archer.
the archer.
You know, Robin is a nickname for Robert back in that time, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
But I'm not Robin Hood.
You don't want a cool name like Little John or the Lionheart?
What? Are we Robin from the Hood? I mean, what the fuck?
No, that's the modern remake. Robin from the Hood. Yeah, that's not quite what Robin Hood means, but that's okay. We'll get into that. We'll touch base a little bit into that. So before I get into, well, today's a little more history based. Let's start by saying that because we're going to actually explore a non-video game figure in Robin Hood, and then we'll go into how video games have captured him throughout the years. So a little bit of history, a little bit of video game history, mix of the two. But before I get into all of that, why don't you talk to our listeners and tell them about other things that have happened during this week in gaming history?
Sure thing, Dave. And with that, kicking it off on November 30th, 1984, Excite Bike was released for the Famicom in Japan, introducing players to a fast paced motocross racing experience that became one of Nintendo's earliest hits. Developed by Shigeru Miyamoto, Excite Bike featured side scrolling gameplay where players raced against the clock or AI competitors, navigating ramps, obstacles, and overheating engines. A standout feature was the track editor, which allowed players to design and customize their own courses, a groundbreaking addition for the time. With its simple yet addictive mechanics and smooth controls, Excitebike became a fan favorite, helping to establish Nintendo's reputation for crafting accessible, engaging games and setting the stage for future racing titles in the company's catalog.
Also, a step en route to Super Mario Brothers. That's part of that story. We have a whole episode on it. Excite Bite is definitely part of that story, so go and check that out.
Yeah, you do that. Next, on November 26, 1988, Snatcher was released for the PC 8801 and MSX2 in Japan, marking one of Hideo Kojima's earliest ventures into storytelling driven gaming. A cyberpunk adventure heavily inspired by films like Blade Runner, Snatcher followed Gillian Seed, a junker tasked with hunting humanoid robots called Snatchers, in a dystopian future city. Combining cinematic storytelling, investigative gameplay, and a richly detailed world, Snatcher set a high standard for narrative depth in video games. While the original version was incomplete due to development constraints, later versions, including the Sega CD release, expanded on the story and introduced the game to a broader audience. Snatcher became a cult classic, praised for its mature themes, complex characters, and groundbreaking approach to interactive storytelling, solidifying Kojima's reputation as a master of narrative driven design.
I don't know if that solidified it, but it was definitely a step. I know I wrote that, but it was definitely a step in the right direction. We talked about it during our episode on Hideo Kojima. So you know what? Go check that out.
Yeah, you can listen to our opinion then versus Dave's wrong opinion now.
Yeah. Yes, you can.
Yeah.
I'm wrong.
Next, on November 27th, 1993, Illusion of Gaia was introduced for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System in Japan, delivering an action RPG experience that blended engaging gameplay with a rich, emotional narrative. Developed by Quintet and published by Enix, the game followed Will, a young adventurer with mysterious powers, on a journey to uncover ancient ruins, solve puzzles, and battle dark forces threatening the world. Illusion of Gaia stood out for its dynamic combat system, seamless transformations between characters with unique abilities, and its globetrotting storyline inspired by real world landmarks like the Great Pyramid and Angkor Wat. Praised for its compelling characters, haunting music, and balance of action and exploration, Illusion of Gaia became a cult favorite and remains a cherished entry in the SNES library, celebrated for its ambitious storytelling and gameplay.
And is a fantastic game. Absolutely fantastic game. We had that. I had that in my SNES library, and I would highly recommend it to anybody.
And clearly one that I struggle with the pronunciation of the name of.
Illusion of Gaia.
Gaia. I say Gaia sometimes. I don't know. Gaia sounds makes more sense, but
That's all right.
I don't know. Maybe it's because it's I first ever read that word when I was young and just never got out of the habit because it's not a word you see every day.
Very true.
Next, on November 24th, 1995, Bungie released Marathon 2 Durandale, the sequel to the critically acclaimed Marathon, expanding the series' influence in the first person shooter genre. Set in a richly detailed sci fi universe, Marathon 2 followed the story of a security officer working with the rogue AI Durandale to explore alien ruins and battle the mysterious before. The game introduced expansive elements, a shift to 16-bit color graphics, and a larger focus on multiplayer, offering cooperative and competitive modes that became fan favorites. Praised for its intricate storytelling, atmospheric design, and innovative gameplay mechanics, Marathon 2 became a landmark title for Mac gaming and showcased Bungie's growing prowess in crafting immersive shooter experiences, laying the groundwork for their later success with the Halo series.
Yep, that's what caught the eye of a bunch of people, including Microsoft, who ended up purchasing Bungie just before, well, while they were making Halo. To be honest with you,
Yeah, so good game, good release.
check it out in the Halo story. Check it out in the Microsoft story, which we recently did for the Xbox. Whole bunch of good stories that we talked about that purchase.
And last up for this week, on November 26, 2019, Facebook announced its acquisition of Beat Games, the developer behind the highly popular virtual reality rhythm game Beat Saber. This move marked a significant step in Facebook's commitment to expanding its presence in the VR space through its Oculus division. Beat Saber, known for its intuitive gameplay and energetic music based challenges, had already become a flagship title for VR platforms, driving hardware adoption and showcasing the potential of immersive gaming. With the acquisition, Facebook aimed to support Beat Games in delivering additional content, expanding the game's music library and enhancing its overall experience. The deal underscored Facebook's vision for VR as a key component of its future strategy and solidified Beat Saber as one of the defining games of the medium.
Yes. Beat Saber's good.
Yeah, I enjoyed it, that's for sure.
I was waiting to see what you would say about it.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't play the VR a whole lot, but
I think I have it on. Now I know I have it on my Steam.
yeah.
Awesome. Rob, if I were to ask you who it is that steals from the rich and gives to the poor, who are we talking about?
Ebenezer Scrooge.
Ebenezer. No, not Ebenezer Scrooge. You know, there are a few names that speak of rebellion,
Luke
and
Skywalker.
that is another name that speaks of rebellion, true. But also the fight for justice.
Batman.
That is that is accurate. Yeah, Batman definitely fights for justice. But we're not talking about Luke Skywalker, Batman, or Ebenezer Scrooge. We are talking about Robin Hood.
But
But who
who is he?
who was Robin Hood and how did he become a famous outlaw? So the debate about whether or not there existed an actual Robin Hood has been and probably forever will be a spirited debate. The name Robert was incredibly common, and Robin is a nickname or pet name. We call it a diminutive of Robert, the same way that we use Charlie for Charles. So, you know, Robin was a kindly used name. And the last name Hood, to be fair, the surname Hood, it would refer to someone who made hoods, a hood maker, or unfortunately, with the way they use surnames back when, it could also just be the name of someone who wore a hood as a head covering.
Simpler times.
Yeah, simpler times. So it should really come as no surprise then that the earliest actual recordings in anywhere of a Robin Hood are actually in the records of several different English justices, no doubt referring to criminals who wore a hood during their criminal acts. In fact, between 1261 and 1300, there are 8 different references to a Robin Hood in different variations throughout England. And when I say different variations, there's Robin Hood. There's Robin Wood, which was a close word for Robin Hood. Robin Hood, one word, Robin Hood, 2 words. It's, you know, back then language wasn't consistent, so it's seen in a whole bunch of different ways. Now, the earliest known literary reference is found in an English narrative poem. It's called The Paris Plowman. It's kind of like I don't want to say a children's nursery, but let's say a English narrative. And that was written around 1370. So we're talking, you know, we had references to Robin Hood in the 13th century on. From there, we see Robin Hood slowly snake its way into various ballads and poems in the English tradition. So, to completely understand why a figure that would take from the rich and give to the poor would capture people's imagination and become the subject of songs and poems and later literature, we kind of have to look at what was going on in England at the time. So, from 1199 to 1216, just prior to any of these references, since we see it for the first time about 1260, England was ruled by King John. Now, John was the youngest son of King Henry II and Eleanor, Duchess of Aquitaine. As a result, he was often nicknamed John Lackland, as in John without land, because as the youngest child, he was not expected to inherit land at all. And that's savage. John Lackland.
That is pretty savage.
For medieval times, that's savage. In 1173, arrangements were made for John to marry the daughter of a count, the Count of Marion. And as part of that arrangement, 3 castles were going to be bequeathed upon the couple. How cool is that? You get married, they give you 3 castles.
That's pretty cool, Dave.
And these castles were a part of King Henry's oldest son, who is also known as Henry the Young King's promised inheritance. So they were once promised to Henry the Young King as his inheritance, but now they were being given to John Lackland, his youngest brother, as part of the dowry when they got, he got married off, right? So, real quick, because I think it's really fascinating. So, Henry the Young King, that name, you don't hear names like that very often, right?
Right.
He was called so because he was crowned as king during his father's lifetime. And that was done so because he was one of five brothers, and his father wanted there to be kind of no question as to who would inherit the crown. Because really, the line of succession that we're used to in the monarchy, the naming of kings and princes, that kind of stuff hadn't been established yet at this point. With that being said, the way that things played out, Henry the Young King never held any power, and he's not considered in the line of succession when it comes to kings, because we have Henry the Second and the Third, and so on and so forth. He's not numbered or considered because he never actually came into power. And as far as I know, we call him a junior king. He's the only junior king in English history.
Well, that's kind of a slap in the face.
It's kind of cool, huh?
Yeah. I mean, cool is one way of putting it.
Well, it's his own fault.
Sure.
So back to the story, these castles were bequeathed onto John Lackland, which ticked the brother off, right? I don't know what they would have called him after that. John Three Castles, I don't know. He wouldn't have been John Lackland anymore, that's for sure. But so Henry the Young King is ticked off because dad's given away his castles, and he's got all these aristocrats in his ear that are basically telling him to overthrow his dad, because truth be told, they were going to benefit financially from a transition of power. So they put this bug in this ear and they pledge his support against him, and Henry's already ticked off. So Henry convinces all his other brothers, aside from John, to revolt against the king. So from 1173 to 1174, there's this revolt with these three brothers against King Henry II. Even the queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, she was feuding with her husband at the time for reasons I can't remember. So she even joined their cause. Before she could make it to where they were, because they eventually left his court and went to her dad's court, their father-in-law's court. Before she could make it to the court, she was captured by Henry II and kept as a prisoner of war during this revolt. So that was fun. So the brothers all moved to, I think, Daddy's court, Grandpa's father, Eleanor's father-in-law, if I remember right, and they took arms against the king. And this revolt lasted 1173, 1174. It lasted about 18 months altogether, and 20 castles, along with their towns, were destroyed across southern Scotland into Brittany. A lot of people died. Not a great time. In the end, though, the revolt was squashed, and the brothers kind of went back to live out the rest of their life in their father's court. Didn't end up that way. So what happens when people are swept up in the family squabbles is that they're not very happy about it, right? Because their towns are being destroyed, their livelihoods are being destroyed, they're being conscripted into armies fighting pointless wars, right? Because dad and his son are squabbling over castles that doesn't matter to these people.
True.
So there were revolts happening throughout the countryside. The people, the barons, the aristocrats, they were all revolting. They were all unhappy about being pawns in the family squabbles. One of the other sons, Richard the First, we know him as Richard the Lionheart because later on he became a great military leader in the Crusades. He helped squash the rebellions. But the family's issues persisted. There was always this uneasy tension between all of them at this point. And at one point, King Henry II demanded that Richard, the Lionheart, pay homage to Henry the Young King, the junior king, but he refused, so they all started fighting. So the brothers
Wow.
end up fighting against one another. Richard is fighting against Henry the Young King. They're all going against one another. Henry the Young King dies at some point during this endeavor, and Richard ends up going against his father because King Henry II is still pissed off that he defied him. So they're going against one another. And that didn't end well for Henry II. Henry II eventually loses a number of battles, loses altogether, and Richard concedes, or Henry concedes rather, and Richard is named as the heir apparent to the throne. And then coincidentally, a few days later, King Henry dies, and Richard the Lionheart becomes King Richard the First. Okay?
Okay.
So King Richard goes away to fight the Third Crusades. He's a very good military guy. Goes away to fight the Crusades. And while he's away, his brother, John Lachlan, teams up with Philip of France, and they revolt against King Richard.
Wow.
This is crazy. At some point during that endeavor, Richard takes a crossbow to the shoulder, it gangrenes, and he dies. And then John Lachlan becomes King John the First.
Wow. What the hell was going on?
So King John then has a falling out with Philip of France, and they go to war in 1202. And in order to fund that war, King John has to heavily tax his people and conscript from the lands. He needs to build an army, so he takes from he takes the town people. And so for the next 10 years, King John reigns brutally over his people because he needs the money and the resources to fight this war with France. And so the first decade of the 1200s are not pleasant for England, basically. And so he comes back from this endeavor at some point. He's still fighting Philip, but it's back and forth. There's laws in the battle. And he comes back, and his people are tired of this, tired of going to war, tired of being poor because of the war. So they revolt against him. And that revolt is when basically the Magna Carta is created. That's the result of it. The Magna Carta is created, and Magna Carta, if you don't know, is pretty much one of the earliest documents that resembles a modern Bill of Rights. It is, it's the document upon which a lot of your constitutions and your Bill of Rights they kind of got the ideas from. And I know that was a long-winded story. It's hilarious to me that everyone revolts against everyone. It's a whole family squabble, and they just kept going at it and going at it and going at it. And the people that suffered the most were the people in Britain, right? In England. And so what I want you to understand is that the figure of Robin Hood emerged after a very tumultuous period in English history when the monarchy was largely seen as an organization that robbed from the common people to fund wars and fight family squabbles. So it should come really no surprise that in the midst of this, people develop stories and poems and songs around a figure that would fight against that injustice, that would do the opposite of what was being done to them, in that it was going to steal from the rich and give back to the poor, whereas the monarchy was taking from the poor and giving to the rich. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah, it definitely makes sense. I can understand it.
There are some ideas for a real Robin Hood. You know, there are outlaws around Sherwood Forest that we think might be a Robin Hood. There are other figures that resemble this model of behavior, but realistically, the general consensus is there is no historical Robin Hood. He is a folklore, a mythological figure that basically was created in this period, a figure that people can rally to rally the troops to fight against the system. We're still doing that to this day. And so throughout the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, Robin Hood became the subject of many ballads with names like Robin Hood and the Butcher, Robin Hood and the Beggar, Robin Hood's Golden Prize. There are tons of them. And they're all the same themes where Robin Hood is good versus evil, and Robin Hood, takes from the king and the king is mean and unjust, and Robin Hood fights against the sheriff of Nottingham, who's the bad guy, again, evil and unjust, taking from the villagers. There are all these variations of it. I mean, there are literally dozens upon dozens of these ballads. And of course, Robin Hood translated into other forms of media too, right? So the first record of a Robin Hood play being performed was in 1426 in Exeter. We have books on Robin Hood as early as 1678. So that became a thing. And so it should really come as no surprise that as film became a thing and man started performing on a screen, that Robin Hood was chosen as a character. Not only that, but Robin Hood wasn't real, right? So even to this day, Robin Hood as a mythological figure is public domain. So there is no one to answer to if you is Robin Hood. So for that reason, he was, a popular character. Robin Hood and His Merry Men was a silent film. This silent film, Robin Hood and His Merry Men, was the first appearance of Robin Hood on screen. It was released in 1908. So, and we've had Robin Hood throughout the years on film. Like I said, we had the Errol Flynn, his most famous one. We had what Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves with Kevin Costner in the '90s. There's more recent ones too, aren't there? They've tried to do Robin Hood in the last decade. I just can't remember who played Robin Hood in the last decade. Can you?
No, not at all.
Yeah, I know they keep trying it. So it goes without saying that as television became interactive, that Robin Hood was no doubt as a figure with a really good established story and a really basic core message, right? Rob from the rich, give to the poor, and public domain. Robin Hood's a good figure to make a video game on. There's no consequences, and you already have a plot established. So, of course, that's why we're here today. And so we're going to take a look at Robin Hood video games throughout history. But of course, first we had to learn about Robin Hood himself because we're a history podcast. So there's your history for today.
Woo, history.
Woo, history. So, Rob, while Robin Hood was out in Sherwood Forest pulling off daring heists, that kind of success really makes me think about how easy it is these days to start something bold like your own podcast.
I mean, I might not be robbing from the rich, but sharing my stories with the world? That's something I could get behind. But starting a podcast sounds a bit more complicated than stringing a bow.
Well, not if you've got Zencaster by your side. Zencaster is an all in one podcasting platform that makes it incredibly easy to record high quality audio and video all from your web browser. No need for fancy equipment or tricky setups. Just log in, hit record, and you're good to go.
So I can start recording my podcast about my favorite Robin Hood games with just my laptop? Well, that sounds a lot easier than fighting off the Sheriff of Nottingham.
Exactly. And with Zencaster's post production tools, you'll sound like a pro. It automatically removes background noise, balances your audio, and even cuts out those awkward pauses or filler words like and ah. It's like having your own editor on your side, making sure that your podcast is polished and ready for release.
That sounds perfect. But once I've recorded my episodes, how do I get my podcast out there?
Well, that's the best part. Zencaster also helps you distribute your podcast to all the major platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. It's a one stop shop for everything you need to launch and grow your show.
All right, I'm ready to take up the mantle of Robin Hood of podcasting. So, how can our listeners get started?
It's simple. Just head over to zencaster.com/pricing and use our offer code, all one word, memory card lane. You'll get 30% off the first month of any Zencaster paid plan. Whether you're launching your first episode or fine tuning your existing podcast, Zencaster makes it absolutely easy.
Sounds like a steal without the risk of getting caught by the sheriff. So, listeners, if you've ever dreamed of starting your own podcast, now's the time to do it.
Exactly. Head to zencaster.com/pricing and use our offer code, all one word, memory card lane, and you can get 30% off your first month. Start sharing your voice with the world today.
All right, now let's get back to the legendary adventures of Robin Hood.
So, the first time that we know of Robin Hood being depicted in a video game is a game called Robin to the Rescue. It's a single screen platformer designed for the Commodore 64. Written by John Shea and published by Solar Software, Robin to the Rescue's initial screen asks players to guide Robin along the 12 walls of the castle to rescue the maiden from the evil sheriff. Classic Robin Hood story.
Oh, for sure.
The same year, a company called Zonox released a game called Robin Hood for the ColecoVision and Atari 2600. The packaging asked the hero of Sherwood The packaging asked the hero of Sherwood to battle his way through 4 screens to the sheriff's castle to rescue Maid Marian and steal the gold. A few years later, in 1986, noted British game developers the Oliver twins developed Super Robin Hood, which was originally released for the Amstrad CPC, Color Personal Computer, Rob. I had to look that up. I forgot.
Rookie.
They made Super Robin Hood when they were 17. It was their first game ever published by Codemasters, not their last. They would go on to make a few more notable games for the company, like the Dizzy series, which I had a Dizzy title. Dizzy was an egg.
Oh, okay.
It said that Codemasters offered the brothers £10,000 for the game because they expected to sell 100,000 copies. The twins worked on a single computer in the bedroom of their parents' house. They worked in shifts, coding for 18 to 23 hours a day. They sometimes took 30-minute breaks to allow the computer to cool. Sometimes one of the brothers coded on paper while the other used the computer. And they managed to make Super Robin Hood. It was well received and it sold decently enough. So their relationship with Codemasters continued after that point. The game itself was also ported over to the NES. It came over here for whatever reason in a 4-in-1 cartridge. That's actually how we have it. We had this game. It was a 4-in-1 cartridge called the Quattro Adventure, uh, which also had one of the Dizzy games on the Quattro Adventure. This game was also later released on various 8-bit and 16-bit PC platforms as Robin Hood Legend Quest. So Super Robin Hood kind of got around. There were other PC games that starred Robin Hood during this period, mostly made by English developers. So, Robin of the Wood was made by Odin Computer Graphics in 1985. Robin of Sherwood, The Touchstones of Rhiannon, was made by Adventure International. We did a whole episode on Adventure International, one of the early personal computer adventure game making companies. Did a whole episode on them. Go check that out. They made Robin of Sherwood, The Touchstones of Rhiannon in 1985. And there was a title called The Curse of Sherwood, released in 1987. So throughout the mid 80s, no shortage of games starring Robin Hood, right?
I would agree to that.
But Robin Hood didn't always star in the games that were created during this period of time. In 1987, Defender of the Crown, a strategy game originally released for the Commodore Amiga, had a part in it where players could appeal to the legendary Robin Hood for help with their battles. So Robin Hood was a helpful figure in there. In 1991, to correspond with the Kevin Costner starring film Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, there was an NES and Game Boy game released under the same name, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. That same year, 1991, Sierra Online, the Williams. We did a whole episode on Sierra, Roberta and her husband. I can't remember her husband's name right now, and I'm going to get flamed for it. That same year, Sierra Online, the adventure game behemoth, tackled the legend of Robin Hood. They created an adventure game called Conquest of the Longbow, the Legend of Robin Hood. In it, players assume the role of the legendary Robin Hood and his efforts to restore King Richard I to the throne of England. To do so, he must collect enough money to pay the king's ransom while avoiding the efforts of the Sheriff of Nottingham to capture and hang him and all of his men. An interesting twist on the story and family squabbles, for sure.
I would say so.
The majority of that game is a standard Sierra adventure game. There are some mini games mixed in to break it up, so definitely some stuff in there. There was a Defender of the Crown 2 that also had Robin Hood in it, just an extension of the first game. Robin Hood starred in a stealth based real time tactics video game that was published by Spellbound Entertainment in 2002. Now, its gameplay is similar to, I don't know if you've ever played either Commandos or the Desperado series. It's kind of like a top down slash isometric style game where you like control a group of people. Like Commandos is you control like a little, 4 or 5 person army that's infiltrating places, basically.
Can't say I've played those, but I can see what you're saying.
So that game is called Robin Hood: The Legend of Sherwood, and it's a stealth-based tactics game. So Robin and his crew of merry men, they kind of have to evade the cruel sheriff of Nottingham and his henchmen, and the stop Prince John, right? Because Prince John wanted to revolt and take over the throne, which is the real reality of the situation. And so Robin Hood and the merry men are basically going up against first the sheriff and then Prince John. But you can't kill people because you want to recruit them to your cause. So that's kind of where the stealth part comes in, because it's highly encouraged to sneak through the places as opposed to killing them, because the more people you kill, the less people you can recruit into your band, so to speak. A year later, in 2003, Cinemaware remade, so to speak, their strategy title that had players asking for help. That was Defender of the Crown. Remade the first title, and except this time, Robin Hood kind of became the star. Same story. They redid the story, but it's the same concepts. It plays like Defender of the Crown, but this one was called Robin Hood: Defender of the Crown, and they had a whole story behind it. Robin Hood, as usual, going up against the evil king, sheriff, all this stuff, stealing from the rich, giving to the poor. It is a blend of role playing and turn based strategy game combined with action sequences. So it's kind of a hodgepodge of different genres all put together. But at the core of it is that Defender of the Crown style gameplay that people were looking for. So we kind of have those real time strategy games, the strategy game. We have some platform games from the early beginning. But, you know, in the beginning, Rob, you joked about wanting to be an archer, right? If you were going to be one of his merry men, you said you would be an archer, correct?
Correct.
Well, that's not surprising because archery is what Robin Hood is known for. So, of course, that was going to play a factor at some point as people created video games depicting Robin Hood. So, with that being said, there are a number of shooting gallery type games, right? Where like you're stationary and the targets, fly or walk across the screen and you have to shoot them. So these type of shooting gallery games, I think, lend themselves very well to archery, and there are definitely a few of those depicted in the Robin Hood library. There was one called Robin Hood: The Siege. They actually made two of them. I've never even heard of
Oh,
one, let alone that there were two of them. The first one was on the PS1, and the second one was, I think, 2004 on the PS2. Literally called Robin Hood: The Siege 2, which is crazy to think
uh,
about.
yeah.
In 2010, there was an arcade style shooter called Robin Hood: The Return of Richard. I found versions of this for the PSP. I found a version of it for the WiiWare shop that you used to be able to buy games for your Wii on its shop. I found a version on that. I also found a version of it for mobile phones that you just tap the screen to shoot at things. So there are definitely variations on that. It was made into multiple hidden object games, kind of like 2010 one was called Robin's Quest: A Legend is Born. So hidden object games. I think they use all public domain figures to make various hidden object games, right?
Mm-hmm.
In 2021, Robin Hood and a competing legend, Robin the Earl of Huntington, they were both the inspiration for a multiplayer action game, like a person rather, multiplayer action video game called Hood, Outlaws and Legends. Now, this multiplayer game kind of puts you up against one another. It's almost like action fighting, and it borrows characters from Robin Hood lore. Like the first boss is the Sheriff of Nottingham. You can play as Maid Marian. So there are various assets to this game that borrow from this legend. You know, Robin and Robin being men who wore a hood, so Outlaws and Legends. If you want to play this one, though, you have to jump at it really quickly. The company announced that it wasn't very popular and they're shutting down the servers in the middle of February of this year. So definitely need to jump at that one if you're interested in whatchamacallit. And exactly 1 year ago this week, the world was graced with the PC game Gangs of Sherwood, Rob, which can still be purchased on Steam. If you go to its Steam page, its description reads: fight the armies of the Sheriff of Nottingham and lead the rebellion solo or in co op with up to 4 players. Play as one of the merry men, combine your attacks, and free the people in this futuristic dystopia inspired by the legend of Robin Hood. Now, honestly, it looks like a cool, like, action hack and slash that can be played as co-op. It is Robin Hood. It's dark and gritty. It does take place in a futuristic dystopia. It's kind of neat when game developers take those old legends and they twist them like this. Unfortunately, it gets really mixed reviews. Uh, I read through a bunch of them. They tend to boil it down to it's an okay single player experience, but the multiplayer doesn't work correctly, so it's really no fun to try and play multiplayer. But I can tell you that it definitely looks cool. Looks like I wouldn't say a completely polished game, but it's in there. I definitely think there's an opportunity for a like modern, dirty, gritty, really cool version of Robin Hood, Rob. I think that the games of Sherwood tried, but the execution isn't there. You know, if you just take Robin Hood and you make it real dark and gritty, kind of like how they redid RoboCop with Rogue, whatever, what is it, Rogue Cop or whatever they made last year. The Tomb Raider franchises are really dark and gritty reboots. If they did something like that with Robin Hood, Batman Arkham is Arkham. Those are really great examples of a making something into something really dark and gritty. I think if someone did that well with Robin Hood, there would probably be a lot behind that, to be honest with you. So
Yeah, I agree.
you
I
just
think
need
it
to
would be.
make it a really good game, you know?
Yeah, but yeah, it's tougher and tougher nowadays.
It is tougher and tougher. There are other franchises that Robin Hood appeared in. He is one of the hero units, if I remember correctly, in Age of Empires 2. He was in Fate Extra as a I don't know, a figure or something. Crusader Kings 2, which is a Paradox interactive, epic 4 time strategy. Robin Hood is one of the characters in that one. There's a manifestation of Robin Hood in Persona 5. Rob, I don't know about this one. You got to tell me this one because this one's right off the wiki for like Robin Hood and video games. It says in the video game Pokemon Sun and Moon, Desudui is a dual grass ghost type Pokemon, the evolved form of Datrix. Does that all sound right? And the final evolved form of Rowlet.
Uh, we previously talked. Sun and Moon aren't really my two most knowledgeable games.
But is that, do we know that as a Pokemon or is he only in that one?
I
Yeah, you have no clue. All right. Well, apparently people refer to him as a Robin Hood. Like he's frequently compared to Robin Hood. So that's where
right
Robin
on,
Hood
little
is in
dude.
the Pokemon series. so so Robin Hood's kind of all over the place. He's either a major playable, a playable character or a major supporting character in, I mean, that's a couple dozen games. He's not the most popular figure ever depicted in video games. I think that his I think the historical context upon which he was created was much more interesting than his story personally. But, he's there. He exists. He's in video games, you know.
Good on him.
Good on him. That's what I have to say. Good on him too. And that's pretty much it for Robin Hood and that family, that messy family that just kept fighting against one another, fighting against one another, and fighting against one another. Um, so that's what I have to say about that. How does that make you feel?
It sure does, Dave.
It sure does. It makes you feel, right?
You got that right, Dave.
That's
It sure
it. That
does.
doesn't have to
It
make you feel a specific way, it just has to make you feel.
exactly.
So that's the story of Robin Hood and all the games associated with it. Episodes like this are a lot to download. I like doing them because it's fun to talk about the history. It's not as fun to have to fly through all the video games, but frankly, with a figure like Robin Hood, it's not like there are, paragraphs written about Robin to the rescue, Solar Software in 1983. So we just have to kind of glance at a lot of things to get through it all. Um, but Robin Hood is a very fascinating figure. He was a figure that people needed at a really dark time in history, and people held on to that hope, and they got through it, and history went on, and now we are where we are. But one of the really fascinating things about this are all the other things that were brought into it. We talked about Age of Empires, and we talked about other games in the beginning, the Quattro series and Sierra Online, and what else did we talk about? There was a bunch of other things. These are a bunch of other stories. The thing about history is everything is intertwined. And so I would encourage you, because I had pointed them out as we went along, to go back and listen to those old episodes, because there's a lot of really fascinating information in some of those episodes. And of course, you can find all of our old episodes, first of all, anywhere that you can find your podcasts, like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, anything like that. But our preference is going to our website, which is www.memorycardlane.com. Rob, what else can people find at our website?
You can find a calendar of our upcoming episode topics. You can find a link to our Discord server where you can come talk with Dave and I about
Yeah.
games or whatever else. You can find a link to our Patreon where you can help support us, get access to ad-free and unedited versions of our episodes. And you can find links to our social media where I am on several platforms as Rob_O_Raptor and Dave.
I can be found on various platforms as David is Wrong. Each week, we're going to tell you a story about one topic relevant to the current week in gaming history. It could be about a game, a console, technology, just something relevant to the current game, the current week, something relevant to the current week. That's really all it's about. I just have to make it relevant to the current week. While doing so, I hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world as its legacy. Each week, when I sit down to research for each episode, my favorite thing is I get to sit down, I get to learn things. And every time I learn something new, I get super excited because I get to turn it around and teach all of y'all listening. It's a wonderful cycle of learning and teaching, teaching and learning. And so, in celebration of that cycle, we like to go roundtable and talk about the things that we take away each week. So, Rob, what did you learn today?
Well, I didn't remember a whole lot about the English hierarchy, and all the revolts and betrayals and fighting, and maybe that wasn't taught, and that's why. But that's a whole lot of crazy going on in a very short amount of time, and I'm for it.
Are you?
I mean, now that it's history, and hopefully we don't have a repeat of it. Uh, I mean, it obviously led to some pretty crazy times.
It did lead to some pretty crazy times. That is accurate.
So
Um,
it's cool to learn. I mean, I enjoy history. It's it's not quite as big as it is with you, but I think that stuff like that is pretty cool. And I mean, come on, the Magna Carta, that's pretty damn
I
important.
know it led to the Magna Carta. I know that is pretty cool. I guess this can go into mine. I studied a lot of medieval history. I thought I wanted to be a medievalist if I had continued into school and went into graduate studies. I was going to be a medievalist. That was my plan. So these time periods are a thing for me. I really enjoy them, and that whole all these kings and brothers and sons and everyone squabbling amongst themselves. They're a lot of fun, to be honest with you. I really enjoy them. I will tell you that I had never really dug into the mythology of Robin Hood. It's not something that gets talked about a lot. I mean, I've studied it from the literary standpoint because I also have an English degree, and so you kind of know about the stories and the ballads and stuff like that. But I never really looked into whether or not it was historical fact. So it was fun digging into that and getting to see all the different theories and how the historians said, well, we found this guy in this, English book in 1300 where it makes a reference to, Robin Wood of Nottingham, and we think that this might be the guy. Or there's all these little things like that where everyone's got this theory, and it's cool to see how they drilled down into all that. So that was a lot of fun getting to dig into that and be a part of that. So for sure,
Right on, Dave.
that's my
It's
story.
pretty cool.
It is
It's a
pretty
lot.
cool.
Like I said, it's not something you really think about. It's just, hey, Robin Hood, cool. It's how a lot of people look at it. They don't really look to dive into the where did it come from.
Where did it go?
I wasn't gonna make that one, Dave.
All right, Rob. Well, before I take it out of here and we look ahead to next week, is there anything else that you'd like to add to today's episode?
As always, I want to take one quick moment to say thank you so much to all of our listeners for joining us as we dive deep into some of these crazy topics that sometimes are about video games and sometimes not so much at all. But hey, we hope we didn't rob too much time from you.
We
So thank you.
didn't. We didn't rob too much time from people today.
Well, that's it, Dave. So back to you.
Okay. Thanks. Appreciate that little toss back. Well, that brings us to the end of our journey through the legend of Robin Hood and his fascinating appearances in video games. From his early 8-bit adventures to modern multiplayer heists, Robin Hood has been a mainstay in gaming, with each iteration capturing a different aspect of his character. Whether you prefer strategy, action, or stealth, there is a Robin Hood game for everyone. We hope today's episode has given you a deeper appreciation for this timeless legend and the role he continues to play in history. Next week, we're diving into the shadows, though, as we explore Thief, the Dark Project, one of the most influential stealth games of all time. Released in 1998, Thief introduced players to a dark, immersive world where stealth was the key to survival. We'll look at how the game pioneered stealth mechanics, its impact on the genre, and why it remains a beloved classic among fans of immersive sims. So join us again next week as we sneak into history on another exciting trip down memory card lane. Do the thing.
Skibby doom dap dap dum dap Robin Hood.
Nice.